There's a country in Europe where roughly a quarter of the land sits below sea level. Millions of people live, work, and raise families on ground that, without constant intervention, would simply be ocean floor. This isn't a temporary emergency. It's permanent daily life for the Netherlands, a nation that didn't just survive against the sea. It fought back, reclaimed territory from the water itself, and built some of the most sophisticated flood defense engineering on the planet. Most countries treat the ocean as a boundary. The Dutch treat it as an opponent to be negotiated with, pushed back, and occasionally defeated outright. And the story of how they did this reveals one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in human history. Let's start with why this country needed to become so extraordinarily good at fighting water in the first place. The Netherlands sits at the delta, where several major European rivers, including the Rhine and the Meuse, finally reach the sea. This geography made the region naturally low-lying, marshy, and constantly threatened by flooding from both directions, rivers pushing water toward the coast, and the North Sea pushing water inland during storms. For centuries, this created a brutal, recurring cycle. Massive floods regularly devastated Dutch settlements, killing thousands and destroying farmland in single catastrophic events. Historical records describe floods so severe they permanently reshaped coastlines and swallowed entire villages, sometimes with the water never fully receding, creating new inland lakes where towns once stood. For most civilizations, facing this kind of relentless natural threat, the logical response would be retreat. Move inland, abandon the vulnerable coastline, build somewhere safer. The Dutch did the opposite. They decided the solution wasn't to run from the water. It was to control it entirely. This is where the story turns into one of engineering ambition unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. The first major tool in this fight was something now synonymous with Dutch identity: the dike. In simple terms, a dike is a massive raised barrier, typically built from packed earth, clay, and reinforced materials, constructed specifically to hold back water that would otherwise flood the land behind it. Dutch communities began building these structures as early as the 11th century, initially as small, localized earthen walls protecting individual farms and villages. But over time, something important happened. Neighboring communities realized that a dike only worked if everyone maintained their section properly. A single weak point could flood an entire region, regardless of how well other sections were built. This forced an unusual level of cooperation. Local water boards formed specifically to manage dike construction and maintenance collectively, coordinating between different landowners and villages who might otherwise have no reason to work together. These water boards are considered among the oldest form of democratic governance in the region, predating many national governmental structures entirely. Fighting the sea effectively required Dutch communities to organize politically long before fighting the sea required advanced engineering. But dikes alone only solved half the problem. Holding water back is one challenge. Removing water that's already flooded the land is an entirely different one. And this is where the story introduces one of the most iconic symbols associated with Dutch culture: windmills. Most people assume Dutch windmills existed purely for grinding grain, similar to windmills found elsewhere in Europe. But a significant number of these windmills served a completely different, far more critical purpose: pumping water. Once dikes created areas of reclaimed land, called polders, sitting below the surrounding water level, these areas needed constant active drainage to stay dry. Rainwater, groundwater seepage, and river overflow would otherwise slowly refill these low-lying areas, turning reclaimed farmland back into swamp. Windmills solved this by harnessing wind power to turn massive screws and paddle wheels, physically lifting water out of these low polders and depositing it into higher canals, where it could eventually drain into rivers or the sea. This system allowed the Dutch to actively maintain dry land in areas that gravity alone would have kept permanently flooded. This engineering approach proved so effective that the Dutch began doing something even more ambitious. They didn't just protect existing land from flooding. They started creating entirely new land from what used to be open water. Here's the turning point that transforms this story from impressive defense into something genuinely unprecedented. Starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, Dutch engineers began systematically draining large lakes and shallow sea areas, converting them permanently into usable farmland. This process typically involved building a ring of dikes around the water area targeted for reclamation, then using windmills and later steam and electric pumps to slowly remove all the water trapped inside that ring. Once fully drained, these areas became polders, artificial land sitting below sea level, protected entirely by the surrounding dike system and continuously maintained through active pumping. Entire sections of the modern Netherlands, including significant portions of major cities, exist today specifically because of this reclamation process. Perhaps the most extraordinary example is the area now known as Flevoland, created through massive 20th century reclamation projects that transformed what used to be part of a large inland sea into an entirely new province, complete with cities, farmland, and infrastructure, all built on land that simply didn't exist as dry ground a century earlier. Let that settle for a moment. An entire province, home to tens of thousands of people today, exists because Dutch engineers decided open water wasn't a permanent geographical feature. It was simply an obstacle waiting to be solved. But even with dikes, windmills, and reclaimed polders, the Netherlands faced a catastrophic reminder that this fight against the sea was never fully won. In 1953, a devastating storm surge, combined with unusually high tides, overwhelmed existing flood defenses across the southwestern Netherlands. The resulting flood killed close to 2,000 people, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Dutch history. This disaster became the turning point that pushed Dutch flood engineering into an entirely new era of ambition and sophistication. In direct response, the Dutch government launched what became known as the Delta Works, an enormous, multi-decade engineering project designed to permanently protect the country's most vulnerable coastal regions from ever experiencing a disaster of that scale again. The Delta Works includes an extraordinary combination of massive dams, movable storm surge barriers, and reinforced dikes strategically placed across the river mouths and estuaries most exposed to North Sea flooding. Among its most impressive components is a colossal movable barrier system capable of closing off entire sea inlets during dangerous storm surges, while remaining open during normal conditions to allow shipping traffic and natural tidal flow. This engineering achievement is considered so significant that it's often referred to as one of the modern wonders of engineering, studied by flood control experts and civil engineers from around the world. The American Society of Civil Engineers has recognized the Delta Works as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, placing it alongside achievements like the Panama Canal and the Golden Gate Bridge. So why has the Netherlands invested so heavily, for centuries, into fighting a battle most nations would consider unwinnable? Because for the Dutch, this was never really optional. With such a significant percentage of the country sitting below sea level, effective flood management isn't an infrastructure project. It's the fundamental precondition for the nation's continued existence. Without dikes, pumps, and the Delta Works, major Dutch cities, including significant portions of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, would be uninhabitable or entirely underwater. This existential necessity forced the Netherlands to develop an entire national culture and expertise around water management unlike anywhere else on Earth. Dutch engineering firms and water management experts are now sought after globally, consulting on flood defense projects for coastal cities facing similar rising sea level threats, from Louisiana to Southeast Asia. And this expertise matters more now than ever, because climate change is accelerating the exact threat the Dutch have spent centuries fighting. Rising sea levels and increasingly severe storms are pushing coastal cities worldwide toward challenges the Netherlands has already spent generations learning to manage. This is where the Dutch approach offers something valuable to the rest of the world: a completely different philosophy toward coexisting with rising water, rather than simply retreating from it. Instead of viewing flooding purely as a disaster to prevent, Dutch engineers increasingly design with the assumption that some water will inevitably need to be accommodated, creating flexible defense systems, temporary flood storage areas, and adaptable infrastructure designed to work with water rather than purely against it. So the next time you look at a map of the Netherlands, remember that a significant portion of that land isn't naturally occurring geography. It's the result of centuries of deliberate, coordinated human effort, pushing back against one of nature's most persistent forces. Windmills that once seemed purely picturesque were actually essential machinery in an ongoing war against water. Dikes that stretch for countless miles across the countryside aren't just agricultural boundaries. They're the literal difference between dry land and ocean floor. The Dutch didn't simply learn to survive next to the sea. They learned something far more ambitious: how to negotiate with it, hold it back, and even convince it, piece by piece, to become dry land instead. And in a world where rising seas increasingly threaten coastlines everywhere, that centuries-old lesson might be exactly what the rest of the planet needs to learn next.